Tonight on City Lights Live, we are happy to be celebrating the debut novel of a really exceptional writer. One of the great pleasures, and indeed one of our missions here at City Lights, is showcasing the works of writers with great promise and who are producing really remarkable work. And Jai Chakrabarti would qualify in a very big way. We are thrilled to be celebrating his debut novel titled A Play for the End of the World. It is published by Alfred Knopf. Jai Chakrabarti's short fiction has appeared in numerous journals and has been anthologized in the collections The O. Henry Prize Stories, the Best American Short Stories, and was awarded a Pushcart Prize. Mr. Chakrabarti was an emerging writer fellow with A Public Space and received his MFA from Brooklyn College. Born in Kolkata, India, he presently makes his home in Brooklyn, New York. Joining him tonight in conversation is the writer, translator, and book critic, Jenny Bhatt. She is no stranger to City Lights, and we've had the pleasure of featuring her for her own remarkable writing. Ms. Bhatt is the host of the Desi Books podcast and teaches creative writing at Writing Workshops Dallas. Her debut short story collection titled Each of Us Killers was published by 713 Books in September of 2020 and won Forward Indies Award in the short stories category and was a finalist in the multicultural adult fiction category. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, NPR, BBC Culture, The Washington Post, Guernica, as well as numerous other venues. Ms. Bhatt makes her home in Dallas, Texas. So please join us now in giving a warm welcome to Jai Chakrabarti and Jenny Bhatt. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome.
Thank you. So great to be here tonight. And thank you so much, Peter and City Lights. So great to be with an iconic bookstore. A bookstore so close to my heart. And with Jenny Bhatt, a writer, translator, critic I so admire. And with all of you. And I just want to also thank my team at Knopf, Tom, Emily, and I see Catherine Tung here tonight too. So thank you all, and thank you to all my friends who are here tonight, and folks who I don't know. Welcome. So great to be here with you all this evening. And I'm going to get started by reading just for a few minutes and then go into conversation with Jenny. I'm going to read from two sections. The first is from a section that's in the point of view of Jarek, who is the protagonist for this novel. And it's from a section in Poland in 1942. Then I'm going to skip to a section in New York in 1972 in the voice of another character, Lucy, who is the other main protagonist of the novel. Sometime between living and dying, the train stopped. It was the moment Jarek remembered more than any other. 30 years he hadn't grown himself another version. Some memories were like that, bolted and nailed to the mind's eye. You could try to change them, shape them into something they weren't, but you would always be with the boy with trousers that reached his ankles, the boy with a tweed cap found by Misha and given special, and the train was stopped now. Who knows whether for a moment or for a longer time, and the guards were shouting because he thought someone ahead had jumped. He was holding Chaim's hand, who he knew didn't have the heart to move an inch, and the heat had already burned, and he had already cried, and Pan Doktor could do nothing because he was just breathing. He thought jump, but the rifles had colored the air outside with smoke. Still, he could see it. The window was big enough not only for a cat, but also for him. If only he jumped and squeezed through. Except the train had started to move again. The screams had died down. The soldiers had stopped firing. He looked at Pan Doktor, and Pan Doktor winked the way he did whenever a mischief had been made, but no one was going to be told because love was that kind of secret keeping. The train had started moving again. But he saw the sun through the window that was big enough just for him, and what spirit launched his body? What ghost slid him forward? Because it was not his 9-year-old bones that did. Still it happened. He jumped on Chaim's shoulders. He pulled himself up. He went head first, and someone he'd never know who pushed his body through the gap. And now I'm going to skip forward into 1972, and this is in the point of view of Lucy, who is Jarek's lover. And Lucy is with Yarek's rabbi here, and they are in a basement looking at books. The rabbi led her through several more rows of books and into one of the dim corners of the room. He combed his way through a pile of newspapers and file clippings and held up an article. It had a photograph with another bearded man who looked like a soothsayer. Rabindranath Tagore, the rabbi said. The article is in Polish, but you may have it. Tagore wrote a play, Lucy, and I believe Yarek may have felt some affinity to it. At least he spoke about the man's philosophy. The last time we saw each other, he confessed he was taking a journey. Lucy remembered the book of Tagore poems Yarek had given her early in their relationship. Sometimes she'd stroke the leather cover, imagine the feel of his hands. Now, let me ask you something, the rabbi continued. What is our Yarek to you? It was the first time he had met her gaze. The whole time they'd been together, was it a minute, half an hour, half a day, browsing those layers of manuscripts? He'd avoided her eyes, but now she saw they were the color of icy blue water, and from them spread a deep curiosity. What was Yarek to her? She had spent nights at the library reading about his Warsaw before and after the war. She had even become familiar with the history of Dziszbrowska Street, the thoroughfares and alleyways that would have made his world. But what was he? A year of being together, and what did it come to? She saw him in her mind, the chiseled angles of his face, the graceful bend of his neck, the way his hand knew the small of her back, the furrows along his temples, carved from living in a world she couldn't see. What was Yarek to her? Sometimes you have to cross over oceans to answer a question.
Thank you for that, Jay. That was beautiful. And I mean, let me just start out by saying to those of you who have not read the book yet, when I began to read Jay's novel, one of the first things that struck me was how this book, this story, had to be written. It needed to exist, and I'll tell you why. The play, the play in the title, this play by Rabindranath Tagore, is very well known, and yet I would never have known this story about this real life person, Janusz, right? Dr. I forget his last name, but Janusz, having staged this play at an orphanage just before the war and just before the Holocaust. I don't think I would have even gone looking for that information or known of this if I hadn't come across it in this novel. So to me, this is why this more than anything is why this novel needs to exist, because it is telling us something much greater about art and politics and how this play influenced not just one event, and Jay will tell us a bit more about that, but it influenced quite a bit in India and in France and in Germany. So let's start, Poland, I should say. Let's start, first of all, Jay, you've talked in interviews and perhaps even on social media about how you yourself discovered this main event that became the premise of the novel. Could you perhaps share a bit about that with everybody, and then tell us why that caught your own imagination, that you felt, I'm going to have to write about this in novel form? So if you could tell us, let's start with that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jenny. So, I first heard about the story when my partner and I were living in Jerusalem, and we had gone to Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum, and there's an exhibit there called Art in the Ghettos. And that's where I first learned about the story of Janusz Korczak, who had performed this play in 1942, weeks before deportations to Treblinka. And what struck me was that this was a play that I was very familiar with. And as you say, it's a well-known play in India, and it's a play that I'd read in the original Bengali and even been involved in a performance of it as a child. And so that moment I still remember when I encountered the story for the first time, because I thought, how remarkable that a play written in Bengali in 1913 would somehow make its way to Poland, be translated into Polish, and be performed in the ghetto. And this is really in a moment in the ghetto of starvation, suffering, death, trauma. So like, why would a piece of art be performed in those circumstances? And that question so captivated me that I wanted to do the research, and that I wanted to look deeper into the story. And that's where the journey began.
Yeah, I think to your point, I mean, it would have caught my imagination too, just because of everything that we associate with that play and everything that we know about Poland and the occupation and Treblinka. So let me come back to what you just said about you wanted to research it more. So as you began, and I know at the end of the book, you've listed a lot of your sources, right? The research that you did, both in terms of, Poland, occupation, World War, but also, the Indian side of things with Kolkata and the Naxalites and all of that, because the book goes into the 1970s. As you did this research, and I know this book was a long project, I'm going to come to that question too, but as you were doing this research, was there something, well, I'm sure there must have been a few surprises, but if you could maybe speak to one or two of the major surprises, things that you discovered in the research process that kind of, maybe entrenched you further into the story. Because I think with historical fiction, that's one of the things that we love doing. We love the research side because it takes us deeper into the story. So was there maybe one or two things like that?
Yeah, so many. And I feel like as this book has been coming into the world, I have been learning things anew. So here's something that I just learned the other day. I learned that so in Bengali culture, there's this genre of music called Rabindrasangit, which these are songs that were composed by Tagore and then put to music. And so I learned that there was actually a particular Rabindrasangit that made its way to Poland that Janusz Korczak was familiar with.
Oh my
and I
goodness.
thought that's incredible. So I feel like, as I have gone on this journey, I've like found all of these like moments of cross-cultural connection. And just the way in which, I think I sort of had this perception that, okay, well, this is pre-internet, pre-airline travel. People are going to have these more insular views of the world. And as I kept researching, I would continue to find these connections between, let's say Tagore and Einstein, or, who had these like remarkable conversations over the course of their lives. Or this song that gets performed in Korczak's ghetto and gets sung in that situation. So many such occurrences in the process of research.
Which is part of the fun, right, of historical fiction. So talking of Tagore, and you mentioned just a few moments ago, before I forget, folks, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in chat and we will take them towards the end. And there is also a link if you wanted to buy the book from City Lights. So those are in the chat. So, Jay, you mentioned how with the play itself, because it's so well known and you've also been part of a performance, talk a little bit maybe about just your overall relationship with Tagore, because he's such a big part of not just Bengali literati, but Indian literati, and internationally. He won the Nobel in literature, and so he's so well known. But what was your personal equation, perhaps growing up with Tagore?
Well, he's omnipresent in Bengali culture. I've once heard someone say that Shakespeare is the Tagore of the West, and I think that's perhaps referencing like how much of an impact he has had on Bengali letters. He was a poet. He wrote really wonderful short stories, which I consider, I think, to be his genre of excellence. In my view, novels. He was a painter. He wrote songs, composed national anthems for 2 countries. So he was just such a mammoth figure. And I never could have imagined that I would be able to take on a book that involved Tagore, because it's like writing a book about Shakespeare. It seems so daunting if you grow up in that culture. And yet this particular story, this confluence of his play and Janusz Korczak, felt so compelling to me that I couldn't put it down.
Yeah, I think he was a Renaissance man, and I love that you were able to come to Tagore, or at least bring us to Tagore in this novel, kind of in a very different way than we would normally associate. There's this play happening in Poland. Let's talk about the characters now, because to me, you've got an amazing set of characters, and I think, as I've mentioned, I started casting the movie in my head. I'll come to that later, but I want to talk about, to me, the big love story really in this is not Jarek and Lucy, although that is there and it's tender and beautiful. I thought Misha and Jarek is the big love story.
Mm-hmm.
Jarek goes all the way to another continent for Misha. He's remembering more than anything, what Misha's told him, about family and love and all of that. And Misha's been there. He's like this father figure. He's this mentor. And so to me, that's the big love story. And I think part of it is because they have that shared history. They are both survivors. They come to America, make a new life together. But what else? How else do you see their relationship? It's a complex, layered relationship. It's a beautiful relationship. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a seminal love story in this novel. And so they do have this shared history. They're both survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto, but they have very different ways in which they've internalized that trauma and that experience. Misha is someone who is interested in going out, researching the history, talking about it. He's gregarious. He's a community builder. He has lots of friends. And Jarek has a very different experience to that same history. And even though the play was so important for him as a child, he'd rather not go back to it. He'd rather keep it in a closet. And so he's somebody for whom the rhythm and structure of his days, getting up at the same time, having his apartment ordered in a particular way, these are very important. And so Misha is really his connection to the world and to community. And so when Misha dies, which is really the inciting event for this novel, everything turns upside down for Jarek. And everything that he felt was solid suddenly no longer feels that way.
Right. Yeah, that I love how when Jarek goes back to India and slowly he finds out what really happened. I love the fact that you have this restraint throughout the novel, because even when you're describing particularly harrowing incidents, I think another writer, a more inexperienced writer, would probably try to dramatize and put a lot of tension in there. But I think the way that you're giving us space as readers and you're letting us kind of figure out, and you're pacing it well. I loved those aspects of the novel very much. Let me come back to this play itself and the whole question about art and politics. Because we've got that Professor Bose who invites Misha, and he invites both Jarek and Misha to come and help stage the play in a village in Bengal, because he believes that will bring media attention to the challenges that this village is facing. Now, there was a time in those times, whether it was the 70s, whether it was the 40s that you've depicted, when art did have the power to influence politics. Art was truly political with a capital P. And And in today's world, with 24/7 social media, I mean, I feel social media impacts politics more than art, thoughtful, considered art. That's just how we see things playing out sometimes. How do you see, this if there was a play like this being staged today in a village trying to bring media attention, do you think it would have the same impact as it might have had in the 70s? What do you think? How do you equate what happened then to now? Would it have the same impact?
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I mean, let me maybe begin by referencing, I think I think about somebody like Abraham Sutzkever, who was writing poems, in the Holocaust, and he was running for his life and writing poems. He was hiding out in a coffin and writing poems. So I think that the urge to produce art is stronger than really any other force that we have, and this includes technology obsession. This includes whatever kind of modern constraints we have. But I think what is changing is the medium, and what is changing is like how we need to present this to the world. And so like I can imagine maybe this would be a live play on social media, so I think the format changes perhaps, but I think the impulse to create, and then the impulse to witness and to be part of that production, because I think, in India, one of the things that's important is it's not just that they are performing the play to a passive audience. It really feels like the audience is part of the production, that they're all creating something together, which is this act of resistance. And certainly that was the case in Warsaw, which is to say everybody who comes in the audience is as much a participant in the creation of art as are the folks who are on stage reciting the lines.
I mean, showing up is an act of resistance in those circumstances.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and I won't give it away, but I like how when in the novel that staging happens in Gopalpur, which is the village in India, and Yarick, I won't give it away, I'll let readers read it, but Yarick introduces something to make the audience participate, and that sets off another inciting event. So I think that was, to your point, yes, we now have performance on social media and participation on social media, but that kind of participation that he was able to get from that audience could only have happened in that kind of give and take right there. So yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch gears on you a little bit, because you've had a very interesting journey as a writer, and so I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit about your own journey, and then I want to get to the book's journey, because it has had quite an interesting journey as well. But if you could maybe talk a little bit, because I do know you work full time, you have a day job, you're in engineering, which is kind of what my previous life, my job was. So talk a bit about how you've made this kind of transition and how you've balanced the work and the writing.
Yeah, I mean, so first I'll say that I think my writing journey begins with poetry. So when I came to New York, I fell in with a wonderful poetry community, and they sustained me and really helped me develop my craft as a writer. And I think of poetry as this seminal form from which so many other writing forms come. So that was really key in my journey. And then it was quite a bit later that I went and got my MFA. And at that point, I was writing a lot of stories. And I also did a fellowship with the Public Space and became a part of their community. Through much of this time, as you mentioned, I was continuing to work. And what I have found about having a day job is that it can be actually freeing for my writing. because it allows me to have a little bit of a phase shift. So, you know, when I'm deep in the voice of a character, when I'm deep in trying to figure out what in the world to do with this revision, you know, I can put my mind on something else. And when that something else is very, very different from writing, I have found that to be actually like an effective way to be unstuck and to be unblocked. So, you know, of course, there are challenges to that. I mean, there's challenges in terms of time management and keeping focus and connecting with community. But I think there's also benefits to it as well. And you know, I think we contain multitudes. We do many things. I certainly don't believe that you know, in the adage that if you want to be a writer, all you can do is write. So I embrace all of these different dimensions of the way in which we can be writers in the world.
Yeah, yeah, and it all feeds into the writing, right? It's
Yeah.
all filling the well in a way. So yeah, I hear you. Well, and talk about the book's journey, because I read somewhere it started, I mean, it's had a 10-year journey, is that right? And you started
Yes.
writing it 10 years ago. So tell us a little bit about that journey, if you would.
Yes, so, you know, it really began with that moment that I described in Israel. And it took me quite some time to really understand how I wanted to tell the story and what was the story that I wanted to tell. And initially, I actually began a draft that was set exclusively in Poland, and you know, and I realized that that wasn't the story that I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell the story of this afterlife. Like, what does it mean to sit with the echoes, to live with this trauma, you know, to have that be part of who you are, but also to be able to move through it and to connect to the world and to grow as a human being. And when I realized that, then, you know, these other pieces started to come into play, which was India 30 years later and New York 30 years later. But of course, all of those places come with their own weights of history. India in the late 1960s, early 1970s was a politically volatile time. And, you know, I needed to pay respect to that. And New York 1970s, you know, is an interesting, much depicted place as well. So I needed to be able to make sure that I was being true to that moment. And so, you know, there was this process of research that took quite a while, this process of trying to find what the story was. And quite frankly, there was also me trying to figure out how to write a novel. Mm-hmm. And in retrospect, I perhaps I should have chosen a simpler subject, one with fewer time periods. But this is the one that fell on my lap. And, you know, because of the complexity, I think it took me a while to understand how in the world do I think about revising such a book.
You know, I want to talk about that complexity just a little bit, because we were chatting about that before we got started here, which is you've got multiple narrative threads here. You've got, as you said, you've got Warsaw in the 40s, you've got New York City 30 years later in the 70s, you've got India in the 70s, and then you've got this polyphony of voices, because you do tell the story through different points of view. You know, we've got Yarrick, we've got Lucy, we've got Misha, and even the professor at some point, right? How hard or easy was it for you, or how did you go about, rather, getting into the heads of these different characters? Because they're all not just culturally different, right? They're different time periods. So there's the cultural aspect, there's the time aspect. So talk a little bit maybe about how you worked that out.
Well, you know, I would say the hardest for me was getting into Yarrick's voice. So Yarrick is a, you know, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto. He's you know, somebody that I feel is so different from my own personal experience. And that was the hardest part, is like sitting with him, figuring out how do I connect to this person? How can I be true to his story? And I feel like some of the other characters, they came so much more quickly for me. And so like in a previous version of the novel, Mrs. Paul used to be a point of view character, and she had quite a bit of page space. And even though I'm not, I'm not a housewife living in India, I felt very comfortable writing in her voice. And so, it was really, I think, stepping into the voices for the characters who were very different from my own experience, and finding kind of the questions I needed to ask, the diaries I needed to write in their voices, and the right kinds of exercises that I needed to do to unlock their voice, that I felt was really important to moving the novel forward.
Yeah. Well, let me just ask a couple more questions, and then we'll get to some of the questions that are in the chat. The fact that you've got, as we said before, the complexities of the novel because of the different narrative threads, and the fact that you had to do all the research and try and get it right. And you said how you were more interested in the afterlife, in the echoes, the effects of that past, which is never really done, right? The past continues to live on in these characters. Talk a little bit about, how, those of us who read and write historical fiction, we always believe that, the past is that we have things to learn from the past. The past isn't done. Our ancestors are still speaking to us through their histories. How do you, having written this novel now, how do you look back on history and not just these particular periods, but in general, how do you, was there something that changed for you, something that clicked for you in terms of just looking at historiography? And the reason I asked this question, when you said you were doing research, I'm doing research on my historical novel, right? And what I find is you have to be so particular to understand who actually wrote that history. What were the biases and political belief systems they had? Because, that can change how they wrote. And so you almost have to be, when you're doing historical fiction, you're almost being like a sleuth and trying to get these multiple sources and connect the dots in a way and say, but what could have happened? What hasn't been reported? Where are the little holes that exist? So talk a little bit about how you see all of that, having done this much research and looked at all these different sources.
What a wonderful question. And, I was thinking as you were talking about that, I was thinking of one of your short stories that's told in the point of view of a ghost. And I think of that as, in this conversation around echoes of history, which is that we are surrounded by all of the choices of our ancestors, whether we would wish for that or not, whether they're literal ghosts or figurative ghosts, like they are with us. And so I feel that it's, I think that intergenerational trauma is something that is absolutely real. I think that's something that many people suffer from and deal with. And I think the way in which we can even begin to make peace with it is by telling stories. So I think that becomes an essential part of reconciling ourselves with intergenerational trauma, with trauma from the past. So that comes to mind. I don't know if that speaks to your question.
Yeah, no, it does, because to your point, it's a big question. It's just, I find myself tripping on that quite a bit when I'm doing research, for my historical fiction as well, which is, wait a minute, who was telling this story? Which historian and why? Because every historian has their biases. Even if they're academic historians, they will have their political leanings and they will stress one thing over another. They will see one thing as more important than another. And so, and obviously you, with the World War II era, there's so much material, but there's a lot of it that I think things slip through the cracks, right? Things don't get described. And I think one of the roles historical fiction can play is to bring to life those things that did slip through the cracks, right?
I think you're right. Yeah, and I think one of the surprising things I learned in the research of this is that diaries are really not sources that you can rely on. So you do have to cross-check diaries with other sources. And so when you talk about biases, certainly, when people are writing their own diaries, and this includes Janusz Korczak's diary as well, I mean, he's, so for example, in his diary, even though the production of the play is a really huge effort for the whole orphanage, he only devotes a few lines to that and moves on, and so that's probably not indicative of how much of an event this was for them, given that they invited all of the town. And so you really start to have to pull together other sources to get that complete picture. I mean, one of the things that I was extremely grateful for was that in the case of Warsaw, there was so much documentation, and this was done largely by one person, Emanuel Ringelblum, who just stored newspapers, articles, magazines, so many primary sources that we were able to uncover after the war.
All right, well, I'm going to take some of the questions from the chat, and then before we leave, we'll have one light question that I have for you, but let's go here to the chat. Here's a question from Phil Bell. What is the compelling message of the play that makes it so pivotal in times of great crisis? Which is a great question. So if you would, Jay.
Yeah, yes. Hi, Phil. Yeah, so here's what I think is the message of the play that makes it, so compelling. Because, I think Jenny was alluding to it, but it has been performed in other moments in history. For example, it was performed in Paris the night before Paris fell to the Germans, and it's been, so why does this play endure? I think specifically in the context of Warsaw and Janusz Korczak, I think a few things. One, it's a play that is about a child who's in quarantine. And so for those of us who have lived through the pandemic, I think we can relate to the experience of being stuck inside. And this is a child who can only experience the world through his window. He sees boys out there playing, and he says, hey, can you come closer so I can see you playing, and sort of experience that feeling vicariously through them. And so, the Korczak children would have been very familiar with this feeling of being in quarantine, as we are getting a small sense of that now. And the other part of this is it's about a dying child. So it's a child who has some unspecified terminal illness. And in the end of the play, he, the suggestion is that he does pass away. And I think this was really important for Korczak because he wanted to give his orphans a view of the afterlife, a view of passing through that was courageous, that was full of dignity, and was so very different from everything that they were hearing around them. So I think that sense of essential dignity was the really key part of why this play was performed.
Yeah. Here's a question from Heidi Deal. Thanks for this reading and discussion. I'm curious, Jay, if your sense of the novel's structure changed as you wrote the book, or if the structure was something that you determined early on in the process of writing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And hi, Heidi. I would say that I had to question some of the base assumptions that I had. I have done pretty significant revisions on this novel. So I mentioned earlier that I removed Mrs. Kapal as who's a minor character now, but had a fairly prominent role in an earlier draft of this novel. There's one major character that has no trace in this novel whatsoever. And so I think what I understood is that I had started this novel with a set of base assumptions that weren't in service to me. And, when I talk about base assumptions, I mean things like, who are the core characters in the novel, and what do they want? What are the stakes for them? Why are you telling this story about them? And I realized that that recipe wasn't there. And so I had to keep kind of like doing a few structural revisions to be able to get at that more essential recipe of what made sense for this play and this question of art in the world.
Can I just say, I think Mrs. Paul deserves a novel of her own. There was one time where she has this little comeback to Lucy. And I reread it and underlined, I loved that comeback. It was something to do with, remember when Lucy says to the little girl who's worn a sari, oh, did you do that all by yourself or did your mom help you? And then Mrs. Paul has a comeback, oh, these trivial things, they just do them themselves. I loved it. See, I remember it.
Yes.
Okay. Samuel Reynolds has a question. How many diaries of the different characters did you complete or compile? Or did you just do more random entries for each character? Because it sounds like you wrote novels within this novel.
Yeah, so I did write, I did have books for each of the main characters to write in their voices. And whether I'm writing a story or a novel, I do have a set of questions that I ask my characters, and some of them are very mundane and things like, what's your job, and where were you born, and that kind of thing. And then there are questions that are more risky, and those are about secrets and things that they haven't told to other people, and perhaps things that they don't even know very well or understand very well for themselves. And so, I went through those questions with all of the major characters in the book. I think that is the most valuable process that, for me as a writer, at least, is to do that kind of character journaling work. And I think once that's established, I feel like the rest of the story starts to come easily. And so good to see you tonight, Sam.
Yep, that was a great question. Well, I have two somewhat lighter note questions for us to end on. And one is, this is something I ask everybody who comes on my podcast. And that is, what is your favorite book by a writer of South Asian origin, a Desi writer? We already know Tagore, so maybe somebody other than Tagore.
Oh, okay. Well, I listened to your podcast, Jenny, and I was prepared for this question, and I was going to say Tagore because I feel like I should be saying him for this novel, right. But now I have to think of someone else. But so I will say
it could be something you read recently that you liked. It doesn't have to be favorite.
Sure. I mean, one book that I read a bunch of times while I was revising this was Coming Through Slaughter by Michael Ondaatje,
yes.
A Sri Lankan author, and he uses poetry, prose, image. I think it's such a vital work. I mean, I've not read anything like it, and when that's the kind of book that I read when I feel stuck, because it is just so fresh.
Yeah, Ondaatje is amazing, and my personal favorite, and I think it could be because of the movie, is The English Patient. I go back to it. There are lines from it I can quote, so. But yeah, Ondaatje, as I think I interviewed Shikha Malviya recently, and she said you can tell he's a poet writing prose.
Absolutely.
His prose is that beautiful,
Yeah.
So that's great. Reminder to everyone again before we, close out with a couple more questions. There are links in the chat if you would like to get Jai's book, and I encourage you to get it if you haven't got it yet. And so this is, here's something I do. Let me preface this. I don't do this very often. There are very few novels that I read and I start casting the movie in my head. And this is one of the novels that I did, because I just thought it's this really sweeping, beautiful story with all these beautiful relationships and covering these pivotal moments in history. And so I started to do this. I'm going to very quickly tell you who I think could do these roles, and you can counter or whatever. But let's start with Jarek. And he's about 40 years old, right?
Yeah,
but he's an old soul, and he's got the European sort of background. And so I was thinking Tom Hiddleston. Tom Hiddleston,
great,
tall guy.
great.
You've got Jarek, you've described him as a tall
handsome,
guy.
yeah.
And he's got that brooding look when he wants to. So
Yes,
that was him.
I'm with you.
Misha, I thought Jude Law. Because Jude Law can do that. He's just 10 years older, right?
Yeah.
And he can do that. He can be the jovial, kind of funny guy also.
Totally.
And then the Doctor. Okay.
Yes.
I think that any movie I get to cast, I have to have John Turturro. And so the Doctor.
Fantastic actor.
John Turturro.
Yes.
If you've seen him in The Truce, oh my gosh. Oh.
Okay.
Anyways, yeah. And then Lucy, I thought Carey Mulligan does a great Southern accent, even though she's not Southern.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, I love Carey Mulligan. Oh my gosh. Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
I think that's the perfect choice. I never
Mr.
thought
and
of
Mrs. Powell. Okay, now these have to be Indian actors, Mr. and Mrs. Powell. So there's a couple. They actually did a movie as a couple, and they did great. Rahul Bose and Konkana Sen Sharma.
Oh,
so they're both of Bengali origin, right? They're both Bengali. They've done a movie together as a couple. And I just think their chemistry on screen, and just, as a married couple, they do well. And they're very good actors. They're award-winning actors. So
excellent.
Mr. and Mrs. Powell for that. The Professor, Bose. So there's this actor, director, and writer, Rajat Kapoor. And he can do this academic type, political type, and he's got the gravity and everything. So I thought him. Jonas. He doesn't come in till the later parts of the novel, but he's an important character, I think, in terms of the conflict, that Lucy has to deal with. And I was thinking, because he has a Southern accent, kind of, sort of too, right?
Yeah.
And Toby Maguire.
Oh,
got that, All right. And then Miles is kind of this smarmy, oh, I'm better than you, right? Character. He's he's Lucy's boss. James Franco.
Wow. Okay, Jenny, you're really good at this.
It's okay. And then the dad, Lucy's dad, the Southern dad she goes home to, Chris Cooper, and Timothy, this other father-like mentor who's also Southern, Tommy Lee Jones. And I'll stop there. That's, if anyone comes to you, just give them this cast. If the movie is optioned, tell them this is who you want.
That's amazing. I'm gonna have to get all of these names from you. And
I don't do it very often, but I just thought I'd share that as a light, thing. And it's just a lovely novel, Jay. I'm so grateful to have read it and having it exist in my life. So I can only imagine how rewarding and satisfying it must have been for you to have written it. So thank you for having written it. Thank you for having given it to the world. And I wish you all the very best. I'm sure it's going to do very, very well. And everybody, again, please, the links are in the chat. So please do get his book. And maybe Peter wants to, there he is.
Thank you, Jenny. It is so purely a Jenny Bhatt thing to kind of cast the book. I love it. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you for doing the honors. Jai, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Peter. And what an honor to do this with City Lights, and such an iconic presence in American letters and literature. And where would we be without independent bookstores such as yours? So please do support City Lights. And for anyone who hasn't seen Jenny's short story collection, Each of Us Killers, I highly, highly recommend it. It's just been an honor to be in conversation with you, Jenny, and thank you everyone who came tonight. It's been a pleasure.